Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Keith Frankish. He is a British philosopher and writer currently living in Crete, Greece. He's an honorary reader at the University of Sheffield, a visiting research fellow with the Open University, and an adjunct professor with the Brain and Mind program at the University of Crete. He works mainly in philosophy of mind, also with interests in other areas of philosophy. And is also the author of books like Mind and Supermind, Cognitive Unconscious and Human Rationality, and Illusionism as a theory of consciousness. So, Dr. Frankish, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Ricardo. It's a delight.
It's my pleasure. Okay, so since today we're going to talk about consciousness, I guess that perhaps we could start off by defining what is consciousness, because I guess that when people even use the term, perhaps different people mean different things, right?
Absolutely. It's the obvious question to ask at the beginning, but it's not such a simple question. Consciousness is something that we all seem to know very well, perhaps better than anything else. But as soon as you start to try to define it, things get a bit complicated. And certainly you find there are different things that you could mean by the term. Look, let's just start with a very simple use of the term. Consciousness, I suppose, the core meaning is something like awareness. Okay. So one everyday use of the term that we have that isn't really doesn't raise too many philosophical problems is just sort of being awake and aware of things in the normal way. So if you've been anesthetized for an operation and you come around, then you regain consciousness. You become aware of things around you in the normal way and you start responding to them normally.
Yes, but that's interesting because there's a slight difference, at least, between awareness and consciousness, or not.
Well, so far that term doesn't. These are other senses of consciousness that we can move on to. This is what I was talking about there. The sense of being awake and responding normally. That's sometimes referred to as creature consciousness because it's the creature that is conscious or not conscious. And I think in that sense, there isn't too much of a difficulty in applying the term to, say, to non-human animals. If a dog has been anesthetized, you can say it's come around, it's regained consciousness. And you're not there building in any strong claims about what is involved in this. You can see that it's regained consciousness because it's awake and running around and wagging its tail, and So that's not too problematic. Another use that isn't doesn't raise too many problems is to use consciousness, to speak of somebody being conscious of something. So you might be conscious that someone is watching you, or conscious of a face at the window. And again, that just means aware of. You're aware of the face. You're aware that someone's watching you. And that's the use, I suppose, when we talk about self-consciousness. You're aware of yourself. I'm self-conscious in giving a speech or something. I'm very, very aware of myself and what I'm doing. And I suppose when we talk about class consciousness, you're aware of yourself as a member of a certain socioeconomic group. So again, that's sometimes called transitive consciousness. It's awareness of something. Now, as I say, there's an awful lot of interesting questions about what's involved in that kind of awareness. But in itself, that doesn't raise too many problems. When we get into the more tricky areas, is when we talk about mental states being conscious or not conscious. Mental states, beliefs, desires, emotions, fears, this sort of thing. And we can talk about a mental state being conscious or not conscious. Now again, the different things we might mean. One thing that we might mean is that we're not aware of having the state. If a non-conscious desire, say, is one that I'm not aware of having, just in the way that if I'm not conscious of the face at the window, I'm not aware of it. I'm not conscious of the desire, I'm not aware of it. And this, I suppose, Freud popularized this idea, the idea that we have lots of mental states, lots of fears and desires and things that we're not aware of having. And he thought that trying to bring these into consciousness, making ourselves aware of them, would have a therapeutic value. He thought that we were not aware of them because they'd been kind of repressed in some way. Now, set aside what you think about Freud. Some people, the opinions differ, but modern cognitive psychology recognizes a whole raft of mental states that are unconscious in this sense. Not ones that have been repressed, not ones that are traumatic or anything like that, but they're just operating under the surface, kind of taking care of the routine business of getting you around the world and interacting with each other. Okay. And this is sometimes referred to as the cognitive unconscious. And again, we can talk about these states. Normally they operate, as it were, under the radar. You might not even be aware that you have them, that they're there at all. But sometimes they might come into consciousness, as it were. And again, this isn't too problematic. We're just talking about another kind of awareness of something else, awareness of your own mental states. And this is sometimes referred to as access consciousness, because you, as it were, you as a sort of unified agent have access to this bit of your own mind that previously you didn't have access to. And the sort of characteristic way that you can show that you have access to it is by being able to report it and tell someone else. Yeah. And there might be cases where someone else can can alert you to the fact that you have a mental state that you hadn't access to yourself. So I might say, you're really afraid of those things, or you really like that person, or you're in love with that person, but you haven't recognized it yourself. You haven't access to it. And that too that's not the thing that really raises the deep problem of consciousness. You could make a similar sort of distinction, I suppose, for an artificial mind, for a robot. The robot has sensors that gather information about the world, processes the information from these sensors, uses it to guide its behavior. It maybe has plans and goals and all sorts of things some that we've programmed in, some that it's developed for itself. And you might ask, it might have a certain amount of awareness of its own processes, its own mental processes, aware of its own goals. Some of them might be available for it to reflect on and report to you. Others might be sort of programmed in at a sort of deeper level, and it doesn't have any awareness of them. These are kind of engineering issues, whether you have access to something or not. We still haven't got to the thing that's the real heart of the matter.
So okay, but then let me just interrupt you there, since you referred to the fact that we haven't got to the heart of the matter. So let me just ask you this. So, okay, I will put it this way. I think that it was David Chalmers who coined the term the hard problem of consciousness, or the phrase in this case. Yes. And he was referring to the fact that, I guess, that on the one hand, we have the soft problem of consciousness that is related to the fact of us being able to correlate certain states of brain activity with certain properties of consciousness, or with someone being conscious or not of certain internal states or certain things outside, or even being conscious of certain types of information that the brain is processing, but basically states of brain activity that are correlated with consciousness. But the hard problem would be then how we get from that brain activity to what we could call phenomenological consciousness, right? That is how we get from that activity to the experience we have of consciousness. Correct?
That's right. This what's called phenomenal consciousness. That's the thing that generates, or supposedly generates, the hard problem. And that's different from this idea of access consciousness. Access consciousness is not too difficult to get a grip on. There's different sorts of access relations between different systems in the brain. And, there's not so much of a puzzle about thinking about how the brain could have access to certain information, or certain parts of the brain could have access to some information. Say the language center could have access to certain bits of memory and not to others, and so on. That's not too problematic. Phenomenal consciousness, that's the thing that causes it. What is it? What is it? Well, it's the way that we we get into thinking about phenomenal consciousness is something like this. We say, okay, take a case where you're aware of something. Let's actually just start with a few examples. You just focus on something you can see at the moment, or something that you can hear in the background, or perhaps there's some scent in the air, or something you can feel in front of you. Just think of these things, and pay attention to what it's like. Now, what's happening there? Well, let's call these conscious experiences, okay? These are examples of conscious experience. Now, what's going off? Well, one thing that's going off is that you're picking up, your sensory apparatus is picking up information about the world, about the colors and shapes and positions of things in the world, about the texture of the surface in front of you, about the vibrations in the air. You're getting this information. That information is being processed in all sorts of complex ways to extract useful information about the world from it, build up a picture of the world, if you like. And a lot of that information is being widely shared among brain systems. It's available for me to report it to you. I can say what I can say. I can tell you what I can say. And all that is described in sort of broadly functional terms, in the kind of processes that are going on in the brain, information processing activities of the brain. And it's the sort of thing we could fairly easily, there's no great difficulty in imagining how we could get a robot to have those sorts of systems, have sensors, to have information processing systems dedicated for each sense to process the raw signals and extract information from them and then to integrate that, etc. But something else seems to be going on when you have these. It's something it's like. This is the way it's something it's like to see whatever you can see in front of you. I can see a board there with there's things pinned to it. There's something it's like to feel the surface. There's something it's like to hear the rain outside or whatever it might be. It's got a kind of intrinsic feel to it. To these. We're not just getting information. There's something that it's like to get that information. And now it's much less clear that what to say about the robot. The robot might be getting all the same information, be sensitive to all the same features of the world that we are sensitive, might be able to report the presence of them, might be able to say, look, yes, it's raining and this surface is quite smooth, but there are also little rough bits at the edges. There's some coloured patches over there that look like this and so on. It could do all that, but would it actually be like anything for the robot to have those experiences? Would seeing red be like anything for it? And if it was, would it be like what it's like for us? Would red things sort of feel visually the same way to it that they do to us? We could also talk about the bodily senses. We can detect damage to our own bodies and react appropriately. But the thought is, we don't just detect the damage and react to it. It also feels like something. It hurts. Okay. And again, the robot might have very sensitive systems for detecting damage and responding, and it might display all kinds of signs of pain. It might say, ow, that hurts, please stop, I want it to stop. But does it really hurt inside? Okay, now when we're starting to talk about the inner quality of experience, this is what we mean by phenomenal consciousness. And now this immediately puts us into a frame of mind where we get very puzzled. Because we can ask, when you and I look at, say, a ripe tomato, worldly properties, it's reflecting light of a certain wavelength, let us say, it's a bit more complicated than that. And we're both accustomed to calling that property red. Redness, we see it's red. We both all agree that it's red, and we're latching onto the same property. But is the experience of redness the same for both of us? Maybe for you it's like what greenness is. For me, we don't know. It's private. That's the problem. It's essentially private. You can detect the other kinds of things. You can detect whether I have access to certain information by asking me questions. You can't work out what it feels like for me internally, privately. Can't tell whether the robot even has any of these things. This is the problem of phenomenal consciousness. How do those processes in the brain or processes in an artificial brain generate this? It's often, sometimes various words are used for this. Phenomenal properties, the properties of experience, what it's like, what its likeness of experience. A term that's not used so much now is often regarded as being heavily laden with theoretical connotations, is qualia. Qualia, but the what, again, it's from the Latin qualis, what is like. Subjective character, raw feel, or these terms. And this is what generates the hard problem. Supposedly, this is what generates the hard problem. How and when does the brain produce these things?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you referred there at a certain point to a color, and I think that that gives us a good segue to introducing the concept of illusionism here, because I mean, you talked about how perhaps the experience I have of red is different than the experience of you have of red or any other color whatsoever. But I mean, in this case, it is not simply that perhaps I might be mistaken and you not. It is also that when we analyze the world at the level of physics, there's nothing there really that corresponds to color. I mean, it's just different wavelengths of photons, and photons vibrating in different ways and things like that, and hitting our eyes and our retinas and being processed by our brains in ways that evolved to be adaptive to us, but don't really represent the world as it is. And we can talk about colors and, I mean, any other thing, even forms, and also other perhaps higher processes like emotions and things like that. I mean, is there where we move on to the proposal coming from illusionism that perhaps what we experience consciously does not really correspond to what's happening in the world, let's say?
Yes, that's kind of it. The view that I call illusionism, it's not a new view. It's been around for some time, really, from the early materialist theorists of the 1950s were, I think, illusionists, and certainly it's had one very prominent and powerful defender, namely Daniel Dennett. And I see my work as very much inspired by what he does, and as following in his footsteps. Now, he wrote a paper in the late 80s called Quining, Qualia. To quine, it's a sort of philosopher's joke, but it means to deny something whose existence it seems to be completely obvious. And what he did was he took this notion of qualia and looked at things people often said about qualia that ineffable. You can't describe them. If we want to compare our experiences, it's how do you describe what redness is like? I mean, you can say it's tomatoes cause it. Well, yes, we know that. We're good about that. But does it cause the same thing in you as in me? How do we get any grip on this? And it's what else is it supposed to be? Intrinsic. It's a kind of feature of the state in itself. You can't get any grip on it by its relations to other things. It's not that it represents something. It's out there. It's not just the representation of this worldly property, whatever the reflectance property. It's some sort of intrinsic to the state itself, to the experience itself. It's private, absolutely private. You could, and not just in the sense that it's somehow buried away in my head. Your brain surgeon could explore my brain in the utmost detail, but would never ever encounter qualia. It doesn't really seem to. And it's also supposed to be directly known. We're supposed to be aware of these things in a kind of immediate way. There's no possibility of being wrong about them because they're just there, presented to us, revealed to us, as it were. The redness is not. It's not that I say, well, this experience, it has this kind of red character, but I could be wrong about that. Maybe it's green, but it's it's the immediate feel of experience. And they just, the problem with these things is that they just don't seem to have any place in the physical world as we know it. If you didn't have them yourself, you would never suspect that anyone else had them. You wouldn't find any evidence of them from exploring other people's behavior or their brains. And so what Dennett did with this notion is he kind of took it apart a bit and used a series of thought experiments or intuition pumps to show that really it doesn't, it breaks down. It supposes that there's some kind of sort of, like, I mean, he develops this idea in later papers, that there's some sort of headquarters in the brain, as it were, where all the information that's coming from this is kind of presented to you, to the sort of the real you, who is kind of inside your brain, as it were, and is presented with this stuff, and then you react to it. So you get presented with the pain or the redness, and then you react to it, and it's kind of in there, and it's at that. And there's some sort of central point in the brain, a point in time and a point in space. And that's kind of presupposed by this way of talking about qualia as being immediately presented, for example, as being private. And he took this, I won't try to go through the paper, but I certainly encourage everyone to read it. And he showed really that it is, I was going to say incoherent, that it doesn't really fit together, the concept. But certainly that it's not really doing any useful work for us. There's no way of identifying, there'll be certain questions we can ask about qualia, whether qualia have changed in certain circumstances, for instance, which cannot be answered either by neuroscience, obviously, or by the subject themselves. Have my qualia changed, or is it just my memory of the qualia that have changed? They become, the more we try to think about it, the more mysterious and elusive this thing becomes. And so his idea was that this notion is really doing no explanatory work for us. It simply takes us down a dead end where we are confronted with questions we can't answer. And the best thing to do is simply to drop it. It's not helping us. It's a way of misconceiving what's going on. And in response to his, so the name that he gives to this inner arena that I talked about, the central, the Cartesian theatre, and the idea is that Descartes thought there really was a central headquarters in the brain, in the pineal gland, and that was the sort of the kind of relay station to the soul, and so all the information from the senses was relayed to the pineal gland, and then it kind of broadcast this information to the soul, the immaterial soul, wherever that's located, and the soul similarly broadcast its commands back to the pineal gland. And Dennett's idea is that the most modern philosophers of mind, psychologists, have given up the idea of a soul, but they still tend to have this picture of there being some sort of central locus of awareness and control. That's where we experience the qualia and where we issue our commands, exercise our free will. And this picture it's inconsistent. It generates a load of unanswerable questions. It's completely inconsistent with what we know about how the brain is organized. There is no headquarters. There is no central. So we just need to rethink. And his whole project really has been to get people to rethink consciousness, to think themselves out of this very intuitive and compelling way of thinking about consciousness. And of course, then he, in 1991, he wrote published a long, 91, 92, I can't remember, a long book, Consciousness Explained, with a provocative title, but intentionally provocative, I think, in which really he invites us he explains why this way of thinking of consciousness is so unhelpful, and then invites us to rethink it. And the upshot of this is the sort of view that I've labeled illusionism, and Dennett talks about consciousness and illusion. It's the idea that when we try to think about our own minds, try to introspect and form and report what it's like for us, we come out with this kind of stuff, the sort of stuff that about phenomenal consciousness and about the feel of experience. But this is a sort of illusion. It's not really like that. It's a kind of tale we tell about ourselves, a bit like the tale we tell about us having a self, as some sort of persisting thing that can persist throughout our lives and that is kind of in control of everything. It's the same. So it's a kind of story we tell, a kind of narrative we tell that makes sense of the kind of things we're sensitive to about our own minds, but isn't, and corresponds in interesting ways to what is actually happening in our brains, but not, it doesn't reveal reality, internal reality to us in the way that we kind of take it to. So what is really going on when you're confronted with, say, a tomato or something, is that your senses are being bombarded with all kinds of stimuli. They're being processed. There's a whole host of reactions to these stimuli. If you if you're hungry and you like tomatoes, it might make you want to grab it and eat it. If you have bad memories of tomatoes, if your parents made you eat tomatoes and you hated them, it's going to have all kinds of associations. You might think of, you might think of summer, you might think of all kinds of, a huge array of sensitivities are activated when you are confronted with a tomato or anything. And all this complexity, we're not aware of all its detail. But we kind of say, that's what it's like. And we sum it up in this, it has this feel. There isn't this simple, ineffable feel. There are lots and lots of complex, perfectly effable detail that we don't have proper access to. And it's it's a sort of the way, the metaphor, maybe I should, I don't want to run ahead too much, but the metaphor Dennett likes to use is of the user interface on a computer. That your computer, the desktop of your computer, the graphical user interface. It has icons, wastebasket, files, directories, and you can perform operations like by moving these things around. Now, these things do correspond to states and processes within the computer. When you delete a file, something happens on the hard disk. But it's nothing really like something being put in a bin. It's about ones and zeros being deleted. But of course, to operate at that level, at the level of even at the level, say, of MS-DOS or of machine code, is much too complicated for most people to do. So we have this little icon and we drag it across, and that we understand that. But there isn't really a waste bin in there. What it's doing is executing a lot of more complex commands that we don't really need to know about. And the idea is something like that, is that consciousness is something like that. It's a sort of user interface in our own brains. And so these constructs that we talk about, the feel of experience and so on, or free will maybe, these are like ways of understanding and manipulating ourselves that are good enough for everyday purposes. But they are sort of like metaphors, fictions, caricatures, vast oversimplifications of what is really going on there. And that's why they don't show up at the level of neuroscience. The things that do show up at the level of neuroscience are the things we're kind of gesturing at when we talk about this. Okay. So perhaps I should let you come back on that.
Yeah. There's a lot there to unpack, I guess. But I mean, just to make this point clear, because I guess that for many people, illusionism is something that they are getting in touch with for the first time here, I guess. So illusionism doesn't really mean that consciousness doesn't exist. It's just that what we experience at the conscious level does not have a one-to-one correspondence with something that really happens in the world or in our brains. Is that correct?
We need to be really careful here how we express this, because there are ways of expressing illusionism that make it sound, as Galen Strawson has called it, the silliest thing that anyone has ever said. And maybe I do want to say something. I do want to say that phenomenal consciousness, in the sense that we introduced it as something over and above all the information processing activity and the reactions and the dispositions and all the kind of stuff that cognitive science can get to grips with. I do want to say that phenomenal consciousness as something distinct from all of that, extra, over and above all of that, does not exist. Okay, so I do want to say that. I want to say it really quite firmly, because I think that once you start temporizing about this, then you just let back in all the old problems. You've got to shut the door quite firmly on that. And that, to many people, does seem like the silliest thing that anyone has ever said, because, it's all there, it's here now, and I don't think I'm my sort of, my mental life is any different from the people who believe, people such as Galen Strawson or any other realists. I don't think my mental life is any different. I can understand why they want to say these things, that it's there, the feel, the sound, it's there, and it's like something, and it's vivid, and it's real, and it's more certain. It's known to us more certainly than anything we might know about the brain. Everything else could be an illusion. It could be that the brain, or the external world, could be, as Descartes thought, the external world could be an illusion. My body could be an illusion. I could be some sort of, I could be a brain in a vat. I could be a simulation in a computer. The one thing that I can't doubt away is the immediate quality of my experience. The fact that I can see something blue just there. Not that I can see, that I'm experiencing, that I'm having a blue sensation that seems to be of something out there. This is the bedrock of our experience, the bedrock of our knowledge, the thing that we know that could not possibly be in it. So it seems that I'm saying, and in fact, I am saying, I think, that the thing that is widely, the one thing that is widely regarded as the one thing that could not be an illusion, according to the common sense way of thinking, I'm saying is an illusion. And I do, by putting it in this uncompromising way, I'm making it hard for people to agree with me. I'm going to alienate people. People are going to say, no, come on. And I know people who take a very similar view to me and say, don't express it that way. Don't put it like that. Say, consciousness exists, phenomenal consciousness exists, but it's not what you thought it was. You could just say that, yes, it's real, but it's not what you thought it was. As far as phenomenal consciousness go, not the other sorts that I talked about, access consciousness, consciousness in the everyday sense. Yes, I'm having conscious experiences, whatever they are. But as far as phenomenal consciousness goes, I want to be uncompromising and say that doesn't exist. Now, because it's only by facing up to that and trying to do the reimagining that's necessary to make sense of how we are, to make sense of what's going off right now, as it were, and what's going on. The only way to do that is to try and do without that notion, because it's a kind of crutch, and as long as you allow it in there, it's going to you're going to lean on it, and it's going to do a lot of the work, and you're going to immediately have all of these problems. You've got to try to do without it. So I am being uncompromising. I am being probably alienating people. I am being hardcore on this, but that's a deliberate choice. So I'm happy to say that, look, we call these events that I mentioned earlier, when you pay attention to the color of something, to the feel of something, to the sound. Let's call those conscious experiences. Okay, that's just whatever's going off there, whatever's happening when I'm paying attention that way to that. Then I would say that conscious experiences in that neutral sense don't involve phenomenal consciousness, don't involve this inner, seemingly ineffable, intrinsic, what it is likeness. And we can explain everything we want to say about them without using that notion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I guess I understand now. Okay, but then I guess that there's another complicated question there. That is, so if consciousness is an illusion, what we get consciously in our minds are mostly illusions that don't really correspond to something real, either happening inside us or in the world outside. And I mean, if most of what goes around in our brain operates at a subconscious level, and even people are not really that good at identifying the true motivations or reasons behind their own behavior, so why did consciousness evolve in the first place? I mean, what is the function of consciousness from an evolutionary perspective?
Well, that's a great question. Notice though that the notion of consciousness that was implicit in your question there wasn't phenomenal consciousness. It was access consciousness. You were saying that a lot of things, a lot of the mental activity that guides us, drives our behavior and so on, we're not aware of. It's kind of below the surface. We can't accurately report it. Now, I don't deny that the existence of access consciousness. So I mean, we are aware of a lot of things that are going off inside us. It's just that this awareness going on inside our minds, our brains. It's just that I don't think this awareness involves phenomenal consciousness. Okay, but your question though can be posed illusion. So the point of that is that illusionism doesn't deny the reality of consciousness in the sense that is relevant to that question. But the question still stands, given that a lot of what's going off in our a lot of the mental activity that drives our behavior doesn't make it into consciousness in the access sense, that we can't report it, we're not aware of it. What's the point of our being aware of any of it at all? Why not just be operate completely on autopilot? Well, I think that's a very, very interesting question. And that's another sort of side of one side of my research is on the nature of conscious experience, and that's where the illusionists come. The other side is on the nature of conscious thought. What's the point of consciously thinking about things if, after all, really all the work is being, if the, what's this sort of metaphor, like there's like a big organization with many different departments who are all dealing with the business of the organization, with making whatever they're making, or dealing with orders and responding to things. And then you have right at the top, you have a kind of chief executive who sort of sits and looks at some of this and maybe occasionally gives an order, but does he really need to be there? It's like the conductor in the orchestra, maybe. Is he really doing anything? Maybe the orchestra could do it all without the conductor. So it's a little bit like this sort of question. And I think that's a very interesting and difficult question. You see, in a way, what modern cognitive science has done is kind of sort of inverted the picture of the mind that you had, say, Descartes had. Descartes thought that everything that goes off in the mind is, by definition, conscious. The mind just is this arena of consciousnly. And anything else that, any other processes that were involved in regulating behavior were just mechanical things, like sort of like valves and pipes and things and whatever, with fluid in them, and not mental at all. Now, modern cognitive science sees it kind of the other way, that most of the activity of the mind goes on beneath the surface of consciousness. The cognitive unconscious takes care, and this is really quite obvious if you think about it. I mean, for instance, now I'm talking to you, and hopefully the words that are coming out make some sort of sense and string together, but I'm not consciously choosing those words ahead of saying them. They're just coming to my lips as I'm talking. Now, I've done a lot of conscious thinking in the past that has fed into the way that hopefully, into the choice of words that come out, but I'm certainly not consciously choosing them now. Or think of say a sports player. They've done a lot of practicing, maybe consciously disciplining themselves to do things. But the whole goal of this is to make it so rapid and so fast that it can be done without conscious thought. If you're playing cricket or tennis or baseball or whatever, you just don't have time to think about what shot. I mean, you might have a general sort of plan if you're going to do a certain sort of shot, but the exact timing and adjustment of the shot, that's all done unconsciously. It has to be. That's a sign of being really good at it. Getting so you don't need to think about it, you don't need to have consciousness involved, is a sign of being really proficient. It's not a sign of sort of losing something. It's a sign of gain. Now you're really good. Okay, so and again, in an organization that doesn't need to have people keep sort of telling everybody how to do it, it just operates efficiently. That's what you want. That's the goal. So it's not a problem that consciousness drops out of the picture, because and this is where I think we get the worry about this, is that we tend to think that the consciousness that's us. The little creature in the little homunculus in the Cartesian, that's us. That's what's doing the experiencing, and that's what's doing the guiding. And if the sort of the rest of the brain is doing it without us being involved, then we're not really responsible for it. We're kind of left out of the picture. No. It's all us. We are just biological machines. Okay? All of this other stuff is part of is me. I am the organization as a whole. And if I can tune up parts of me to do this stuff really, really fast, without needing to sort of reflect on it and dwell on it and struggle with it, that's great. And it's not being lost. I've not lost control. I've gained a much higher level of control, much more rapid, instinctive, intuitive control. So what does consciousness do if it does something? The access consciousness, if it does something. I think a lot of what it's doing is, and again this is a theme from Dennett, is a sort of self-stimulation. It's providing fresh stimuli, new stimuli to those non-conscious systems to help channel them in the right way. So, very simple example is you need to remember something, a date or a name or something. And certainly I do this. If I can't conjure up, I try and think of related words. I try and remember. I try and say some related word to myself. Or I try and visualize if I'm trying to think of an address, I try and visualize it. I try and just things that I think might spark off the memory. I could write them down, but I don't need to. I can just do it in visual imagery or auditory imagery. I can talk to myself. If I'm trying to remember the words of a song, I might try going over it in a speech. And what I'm doing there is I'm providing new stimuli, which might trigger something off, make a connection at the non-conscious level that then gets me going again. And now I'm back on track. And it's like a kind of scaffolding to help the non-conscious processes do the real work. An example I like, a very simple example I like, is that in doing maths, simple maths problems, we just do if I say what's 3 times 5, you say 15. You don't think about it. It just comes to you. But if I say what's 13 times 15, you perhaps have to write it down. And what you're doing there by writing it down is breaking down that more complicated problem into simpler problems that then can be done intuitively. And I think that a lot of conscious thought is like that. It's kind of breaking down problems or restructuring them so that the swift intuitive processes can deliver you with an answer. And we can break them down to stages. So in doing a sum on paper, each stage is simple, the answer comes intuitive. Or if it doesn't, then you break that down. And eventually, if you're following a good procedure, you end up with the correct answer. So I think consciousness does have a real role to play, but it's a role not as a kind of initiator of thought and of decisions, but more of a sort of monitor of what's happening and an intervener occasionally in different ways to help steer processes along. But the real engine room of all this is non-conscious.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so what do you think about the hypotheses that are being put forth by scientists who work with evolutionary theory, applying it to animal behavior, including, of course, human behavior, like evolutionary psychologists, evolutionary biologists, comparative psychologists, when they say that perhaps consciousness evolved to serve also a social function, that is to allow for us to to develop theory of mind and to think about our own behavior and of other people's behavior and try to predict their behavior in the future, and also perhaps to allow for us to think about the future and to deliberate our actions and to choose between several different hypotheses. And I guess that at a neuroscientific level, they are mostly referring to the functions that our prefrontal cortex has, right? So, and perhaps we could also connect that with the issue of free will and how we can connect consciousness to free will, to the discussion surrounding free will or determinism and things like that. But anyway, what do you think about those hypotheses?
Oh, okay, a lot of stuff there. I'm quite attracted to look, what I was talking about there really was assuming a sort of something like a two systems theory. I don't know if you're familiar with dual process theories.
Yes.
Daniel Kahneman, Jonathan Evans, Keith Stanovich, people like this. The idea that there are two rather quite different kinds of processing, this swift, fast, unconscious processing that doesn't involve effort, and a more slow, laborious, controlled processing, which does require effort. It's hard to do. It loads on working memory. It uses limited. It uses working memory resources which are limited, and so you can only do it. Only think in this system to this conscious way of a few things at one time at a time. It's kind of serial, one thing at a time. And that's the kind of picture that I was using there of conscious and conscious and unconscious thought. And yeah, so the suggestion that a lot of people in this tradition have is that the conscious system, the system two, actually it's a little bit of an oversimplification to call it conscious and the other one non, but never mind, that will do for now. Did evolve to do things like evolve. Maybe it's more a product of cultural evolution, actually, rather than biological. But that its function is really to allow certain kinds of offline thinking, okay, thinking about scenarios that are not immediately present. Okay, so the other stuff that non-conscious have is very highly tuned to react to what's happening here and now. It's online processing. It's driven by the stimuli that are coming in. And it's kind of automatic in the sense that stimuli provoke certain kinds of reactions, quite complex and reactions modulated by other things that are happening. Whereas the reflective system 2 stuff can be completely detached from the current context. You can think about, and this is how you can think about hypothetical situations that aren't actual. What if I did that? Why might, or you can speculate about people's motive, why might he be doing that? And this, of course, is immensely important for kind of creative activities, for getting yourself out of, if you're in some kind of situation where your instinctive reactions are not really solving the problems that you're facing. You need to stop, stand back and think, what if I did that, something completely different? So to that extent, yes. You said, does this conscious thinking, is it essential for mentalizing, for thinking about other people's mental states? I don't think it's essential for it. I think we can do this kind of thing really quite rapidly and quickly, instinctively. You know, we intuitively we can often just see that somebody is angry or that somebody's threatening or that whatever. But it certainly allows a more elaborate kind of reflection about their motives and the possibilities and about strategies you could use with them. It allows a much richer kind of interaction with each other and a much richer interaction with the world. And again, I think it does this largely by a sort of self-stimulation. Once you have language, of course, you see all this becomes much easier. You can articulate these alternative scenarios to yourself. The easy way to think about an alternative situation is just to say it to yourself. And in processing that the sentence you've created, you will conjure up all the kind of instinctive reactions to that situation that you would have if somebody else said it. If somebody says to you, there's a lion, you'd immediately, all sorts of sensitivities related to lions would be triggered. You can trigger those in imagination simply by saying to yourself, what if there were a lion coming? What would I do? And then you can maybe prepare. And so that's how it gets you out of the moment, out of this. And the sense is really that the idea is that I suppose non-human animals tend to be locked into the moment. They can't stretch their minds beyond the here and now. They can't plan ahead. They can't figure out alternative strategies. They can't anticipate things except in a very sort of statistical way. And that's one of the things that having a conscious mind gives us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just before we get into the discussion about how these might influence the discussion surrounding free will, or if it doesn't really exist at all, I just wanted to ask you briefly about the proposals coming from some people that fall under the rubric of emergentism, because I've already talked with a couple of people about this, and different people have different opinions, but I mean, for me at least, emergentism seems like people are saying that, so if consciousness in this case is an emergent property of the activity that occurs in the brain and that we are able to observe, then, I mean, what do they really mean by being an emergent property? It's like something spooky is going around there that we can't really know what exactly it is about. And I mean, so what is your position about that? And does it really make sense to talk about consciousness as being an emergent property of brain activity?
Well, of course, if we're talking about phenomenal consciousness, then of course I'm going to say it's not an emergent property. It's not actually a property at all, emergent or otherwise. But the idea that it might be an emergent property, I actually think that probably if it were real, then the idea that it's an emergent property kind of, yeah, it's as good as any other. But I think it's a very bad idea. A bad idea, if you see what I mean. So if realism did involve something like emergentism, that would be another reason for being skeptical of realism. People use I really don't like the term emergentism, because it either means something that's okay, but not novel, not really particularly exciting, and doesn't really we don't really need the term, or it means something that I find very unhelpful and that I don't think exists. The weak sense of emergentism is just something like this: that as you build more and more complex systems, you get more and more, you get interesting higher level properties. Like if you put together bits of the components for a computer in the right way, you get new properties. It shows pictures on the screen. It's able to do mathematical operations and word processing and so on. And in a sense, those emerge from you having put the bits together. But there's nothing mysterious about that, because you can see that when all there is to it displaying a picture is having the pixels light up in the right sort of way. All it is to doing mathematical operations is it responding to key inputs in the right way and producing a suitable output on the screen. So there's nothing kind of mysterious about this, and you get these properties simply by putting together lower level components that do the right thing. And you can see, you can deduce that if you have those lower level components doing those things, then you'll get that larger feature, like displaying pictures on a television screen. In a sense, that's an emergent property of all the bits being put together, but it's not a mysterious emergent property. It's a functional property, and you get it by putting together bits that perform the relevant function. nothing mysterious there, there's nothing extra going on beyond the components doing their thing. It's just that when the components do their thing in their way, then that constitutes this higher level feature. Now that's sort of weak emergentism. That's uncontroversial that exists, but we don't really need the term emergentism for that. We can just talk about organizing things to perform some function. That's all it is. Now strong emergentism is different. The idea there is that you can put the brain together, say, and to do all the different things the brain does, all the information processing stuff and all the reactions and disposition stuff it does. And that still doesn't in itself give you consciousness, phenomenal consciousness. That's a sort of extra thing that has to be sort of added on. And, you know, you could imagine it's conceivable that there could be a zombie that has all the neural apparatus but doesn't have this extra thing. And the idea is that when you get a certain level of complexity, this extra thing just pops into existence. Now, maybe there are quite well-defined rules as to when it pops into existence and when it doesn't, but they can't be deduced from the activity of the components. It's not just like some function, and when you have things that do that function, there you have the thing. It's some extra over and above the function. So it'd be like saying when you put the television together, all the components, you get certain functional properties that are perfectly predictable, like it displaying picture, but something else happens, say, when you turn it on, it gives out some weird kind of radiation that has got no relation whatever to the, well, it's got a relation, that's not a consequence of the things that its components are doing, not an inevitable consequence of the things that its components are doing. It's just some extra thing that happens. And we don't know why it happens, but we know that when you just put these things together in that way, bang, this happens. But it's inexplicable. All you can do is chart the occasions when that thing, chart the circumstances when that property arises. And then you can maybe make a list of those, and maybe they'll be able to systematize this, and you'll be able to say whenever you have certain sorts of information processing activities or certain sorts of electronic processes, this happens, this extra thing happens. But you have no understanding of how one comes from the other. That's the sort of strong emergence. It's an extra feature of the world that comes into existence in certain conditions that maybe we can articulate, and maybe we could draw up laws explaining when these two things happen. But it's just a kind of, that's just the way it is. And I don't see that doesn't seem to me to be the way the world works. It's not that people didn't build televisions, you know, people don't build any complex thing by saying, okay, how are we going to build it? Okay, let's just put components together and sort of hope that it's sort of, you know, this thing just appears. No, they work out that if you do that and you do that and you do that and do that, that will realize this particular function that you want. You analyze the thing that you want to, the feature you want, you analyze it in function terms, then you think about what sort of components would produce that feature, would constitute the existence of that feature. I don't, apart from the supposed case of phenomenal consciousness, I just don't see any cases of this kind of strong emergence in nature. People used to think that life was people used to think that life was like that, and it was a sort of thing super added to all the organic processes and states. We know it's not. You can analyze life in functional terms, in terms of nutrition and reproduction and homeostasis or whatever, and have organic materials that do those things and that add up to that, and there you've got it. So maybe there is this kind of fundamental sort of metaphysical extra in the world that just pops into existence in human brains or other kinds of brains. Maybe there is, but I think the more economical hypothesis is that there isn't, and that we should only jump to this radical hypothesis if we've thoroughly exhausted the more economical hypothesis, and we haven't even begun. Well, we've begun, but we're just at the very, very early stages of understanding how the brain works.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about consciousness and free will. Earlier in the interview, you said, and if I'm saying it incorrectly, please correct it for me, but you said at a certain point that basically consciousness allows us to redirect some other processes that go around in our brain. Like, for example, when we're trying to remember a word and we can't, and we try to associate it with other things that we think are related to it, and perhaps that changes somehow the activity that goes around in our brain subconsciously that is looking out for the word there. So, in that sense, do you think that that could be a way by which, through conscious processes, we get free will, or not? Or some sort of free will, at least?
It all depends what you... I've not written a lot about free will, so I don't have anything terribly original to offer here, but I've certainly got a sort of perspective on it. It all depends, again, as with so much, what you mean by free will. What a lot of people mean by free will is some kind of, as it were, the ability to somehow intervene in the causal chain of events and push them in one way rather than another. An ability that isn't itself explicable in causal terms, you know. So I can sort of, my brain could be in this exact state that it's in now, and I could do that, or my brain could be in exactly the same state, and I could do that, a different thing. Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of radical freedom from causal compulsion, as it were. Now, I don't believe in that, and I don't think that even if we have, I don't think we have that kind of freedom. I don't think we ordinarily really, except when we're doing a certain sort of philosophy, think of ourselves as having that kind of freedom. I certainly don't think we need that kind of freedom. And again, it's associated with this picture of there being some sort of, the causal processes in my brain somehow not really being me, and me needing to sort of intervene in some way to push those causal processes in one way rather than the other. Look, all these stimuli come and bombard me, and my brain is wonderfully tuned up to deal with them, and it's tuned up also by all the things that I've seen and heard and learned and done in the past. I've tuned up my brain myself. You know, it's a lot of the way that my brain reacts to stimuli depends on things I've done in the past. So I've got this tuned up system here. Maybe it's well tuned up and nicely tuned up so I respond to other people in a kind and caring way. Maybe it's badly tuned up and I sort of respond to them in a horrible way. I don't. But anyway, it's all tuned up. Stuff comes in, and all kinds of causal processes start happening, and they terminate with some response. That's me responding freely to those stimuli, that situation. It doesn't need there to be some point at which sort of these processes occur, and then suddenly I sort of get in and I say, but do I really want to do that? Do I really want to go this way or that way? And then I can sort of redirect and it doesn't need that. All those causal processes, they are me reacting freely to the situation. Now, of course, there could be constraints on my freedom. Maybe if you've got pointing a gun at my head, for example, and telling me to respond in one way, then that certainly constrained those causal processes to go in a way that they wouldn't otherwise have gone in. Okay, so that was a freedom. Also, more subtly, say, if I've been drugged or something, which again is distorting the way that the reactions. Or maybe more subtly, suppose that throughout my life I've been deprived and bullied and mistreated, and this has tuned up my brain in a kind of way that makes it respond in a very hostile way to other people. Again, maybe that is a limitation of my freedom because I haven't really been able to tune up my brain and my responses in a free way. So we can talk about the degrees of freedom that I have, the kinds of freedom that I have, the kinds of control I have over myself and over my environment. Talk about all these. It's all a matter of degree, without ever getting into the question of, can I really at some point, kind of do some sort of quantum, induce some sort of quantum fluctuation that pushes things down. Why do I need to do that? How would that help? And anyway, even if I wanted to do that, what would be the causal processes that would be responsible for my decision to do that? I mean, the most it seems I can have is some sort of induce some kind of indeterminacy in the processes. But that's not. Hang on, I've got to. That's not free will. So I'm inclined to say that I'm inclined to describe myself as a compatibilist, in that I think we are as well. We're as free as we are. Some of us are more free than others. Some of us have more control over ourselves and our lives than others. But we are not. Our freedom of will is not limited by the nature of the causal process, the very existence of causal processes underlying, by the existence of a deterministic world. Now, where consciousness comes into that, you notice I didn't mention consciousness. I don't think I mentioned consciousness in any of that. I was just talking about my brain and how the sensitivities and the reactions and so on there. I'm quite happy that I'm responding if I'm, say, driving or playing, doing sports or just talking to you now without conscious thought. I'm still responding freely. That doesn't. I don't have to sort of, consciously vet stuff in order for it to be free. In fact, I go for the conscious reflection and the vetting when I'm not sure what to do and I'm a bit puzzled. But when I am sure what to do, that's still free action. In fact, that's sometimes my most expressive. And if I'm giving a lecture or talking to you, when it's really coming and flowing and I'm in full rhetorical mode and that's when I feel most in charge. When I'm stumbling and saying, now wait, what do I want to say? That's when I'm struggling to find the words. That's not being in control. That's losing control, and that's when consciousness kicks in and says, let's try and get ourselves out of this mess. And similarly with driving, it can be a wonderful experience driving and feeling in control of the vehicle, not having to think, should I change gears? Should I, So now, but certainly consciousness can add to this by giving us new degrees of freedom. It allows us to, as I suggested earlier, to adopt certain kinds of strategies, precisely when we either want to explore areas that we're not familiar with, or we're finding trouble with an area that we are familiar with, and we need new strategies, or we want to explore new areas. Then we need to go in for this kind of more slow, methodical reflection, just like learning a new skill. Mm-hmm. You need to explore this in a more reflective, serial, slow, tentative way. And this expands your area of control, certainly. But it's not some sort of it's not an essential condition for acting freely. No. So I think consciousness is an important element of human agency, but it's not essential to it. We can act freely without involving conscious thought.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's very interesting. So perhaps just one last question, and now going back to the discussion we had here about emergentism and emergent properties of the mind, and if consciousness is an emergent property or not. So let's say that we were to reproduce artificially a human brain in some way. So would you say that we should expect that that piece of artificial intelligence would develop consciousness as we have it, also phenomenal consciousness as an illusion, just because that artificial brain was arranged exactly as a reproduction of a human brain, or that we would need to do something to program consciousness into it? Because this is a discussion that people have been having a lot recently, that if AI would really develop consciousness spontaneously or not. So what would you say about that?
Right. Yes. There are lots of aspects to this. One thing I've already, as since I'm an illusionist, I don't think that it would develop phenomenal consciousness, but it might develop the illusion of phenomenal consciousness, of course. And then I think I'll come back to that one in a minute. The first question you asked there was whether if we built an artificial mind that replicated the functions of ours. Is that right? If we built that,
Yes.
maybe of not out of this biological materials, but out of silicon or whatever, and then it replicated the information processing functions of our brain exactly. If it did that, then I think that the mind can be characterized entirely in functional terms, broadly speaking. And so if it implemented the same functions, it would have the same mental properties. So it would experience the same illusions, I guess, undergo the same illusions. I'm not sure that it would be easy to do that. It may be that certain of the functions of the way that our brains operate may exploit features of the biological hardware. It may be quite hard to get to reproduce those same functions in some different substrate. It might not be easy because it may be that evolution has exploited the particular features of the materials available to it to do things in a particular way, and there might be other. It might not be so easy to do those things with other materials. But if we could, it would have the same mental properties that we have. One interesting question is about, but let's just go a little bit away from this idea of an exact functional duplicate. If you've got an exact functional duplicate, then I have no problem. It's going to have the same mental features. What if we designed a system? If we're building AI, there isn't much point in just trying to reproduce the ways that nature did it. Maybe there are better ways, and ways that are easier given the materials available to us. After all, nature explores design space quite well, but it's constrained by where it starts from. We can start from different points, and we can explore different regions of design space. So maybe we could. We don't have the visual processing system, say for an AI, doesn't have to work exactly like ours. Would it then would it then undergo the illusion of phenomenal consciousness? And I think this is very interesting question, and it depends on how you think about the nature of the illusion. Is the illusion just a kind of side effect of having certain sorts of visual sensitivities and certain kinds of reactions and certain sorts of introspective abilities? And it's a kind of side effect. It wasn't, as it were, designed in. It just happens that when you have these kind of limited introspective abilities that we have, this is how you kind of want to describe what's going off. Or is it actually a designed-in feature? And I think Dennett tends to think of it more as a kind of side effect. But there's another writer whose work I like very much, which is Nicholas Humphrey, particularly his book Soul Dust. And he's a little uncomfortable with the term illusionist now, and he wants to distance himself a little from it, but I think he is at heart an illusionist, and certainly in Soul Dust in 2011 he was a committed illusionist. And there he proposes that the illusion of consciousness, of phenomenal consciousness, is really highly adaptive, and it was actually selected for all kinds of beneficial effects that it has. It really he thinks it enhances our quality of life, really, and our engagement with the world and with each other, and it makes us the kind of creatures that we are. It's terribly important. So he says all these wonderful things about the importance of the illusion of phenomenal consciousness. Now, so on his view, you wouldn't just automatically get it from designing an artificial creature with the right sort of the sensory apparatus and sensory processing and so on. You'd actually have to give it something extra. And he actually thinks there's a separate system, a system of what he calls sentition, that is the basis of sensation, of the felt aspect of our mental lives, which came under separate evolution, selective pressure. It's quite separate from the perceptual system. and that and so if we wanted to build an artificial creature like that, we'd have to install a separate system, or an additional system to get it. And I think that's an open question as far as the general project of illusionism is concerned. But certainly on either view, I've no reason to think that artificial creatures couldn't have this. Moreover, I think we could work out under what conditions they would have it. It's a functional property in the end. We'll be able to predict it and infer when they have it from the nature of the processes that are going on. There's no question of it just magically emerging.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I mean, I guess that another question there would be that perhaps when people watch movies like The Terminator, or even more recently Westworld, the series, that people perhaps get the sense that even if we are only to develop artificial intelligence systems to react to human actions as human-like as possible, that just by doing that, in some way, we might risk them developing consciousness spontaneously or something like that. But I mean, do you think that something along those lines could happen, or?
Only if we don't understand consciousness. I mean, if we don't understand what we're doing, we don't understand what consciousness is and what the various systems we've installed in their heads are doing, then yes, certainly we might be surprised. But once we understand, and certainly if we persist with this picture of phenomenal consciousness as being some super added extra that just emerges under unpredictable conditions, some people think it emerges in atoms. Other people think it only emerges in highly developed information processing systems. Who can tell? No one can tell. You can't get inside those systems to find out. So yes, if you persist in that way of thinking, then you could never be sure. You could, you can't be sure that your computer doesn't have it now. I mean, some people seriously think that atoms have it, or a very small smidgen of it. So as long as you persist in thinking that way, yes. I mean, who knows? And of course, you wouldn't actually be surprised because you would never know whether they did. The most that would happen is that they would say they did, but of course that's not the same as, for a realist, that's not the same as having it. Now, once you understand what's going off there, and you understand that consciousness can be not easily, but in principle, thoroughly analysed in functional terms, representational terms, in terms of introspective representations, perhaps, something like this, then there'll be no mystery. You just have to work out what the stuff in their heads is doing, and then you'll know. And of course, what they say to you and how they react to you will be a very important source of information about this. If they're absolutely certainly, if they're absolutely convinced that they have it and they're responding in exactly the same way that we do, then very probably they're like us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. Okay, so Dr. Frankish, just before we go, I've already referred to your books in the introduction.
I must mention one. You mentioned one there, one of the cognitive and conscious. I wrote a foreword to that book. It's not actually my book, the one that you mentioned there, so I just should say that.
What was it? Perhaps cognitive unconscious and human rationality? Is
that I wrote a foreword to that book, and
okay.
Can't take credit for the rest.
Okay. It was my mistake. Sorry about that. Okay. But apart from those resources, would you like to tell people if there are some good online resources if they want to go there and get in touch with more of your work?
There is I think you mentioned the collection of essays on illusionism, which is based on a double issue of Journal of Consciousness Studies from the end of 2016, in which I wrote a target article, and then a lot of excellent people responded to this, some supporters, some critics, and then I wrote a reply at the end, and that's a really nice discussion, partly because it's not just my perspective, it's a lot of different perspectives on this idea. And So that's certainly I would encourage people to have a look at that. And my contribution to it is there's an e-print of it on my website, and I think you probably the authors of the commentaries have made versions of theirs available. So that's a good place to start, I think. Also, of course, I encourage everyone to read Dan Dennett's work. You don't need me to advise you to do that, but definitely should. And I'm currently in the very early stages of planning a book on illusionism, which will be hopefully a substantive statement of the position, the reasons for adopting it, a response to the arguments against it, and the sort of research program that it opens up. I think that one of the problems about the way that we've been thinking about phenomenal consciousness is that although it seems to open up some sorts of research programs, such as in identifying the neural correlates of consciousness, these programs don't go anywhere and can't go anywhere because you can't find the correlates of something that is essentially private. All you can find are the correlates of the marks, the overt marks of this thing, the responses and the reports and so on. So I think that we need a different way of thinking about consciousness in order to have a productive research program. Another paper that I would encourage people to read also is a paper by David Chalmers, a recent paper called The Meta Problem of Consciousness. Chalmers is, of course, a committed realist, but he takes illusionism quite seriously as a position. Mm-hmm. And in that paper, he addresses the question of how we explain the sort of things that the illusionists think are all that needs to be explained, the reports, the reactions, and so on, and the judgments associated with consciousness. And he thinks that is a really interesting question. He doesn't think it's the whole story. We still have to solve we have to, as well as explain why people think they're conscious, we also have to explain how they are conscious. But he agrees that once we have the explanation of the reports and the judgments and so on, maybe then people will perhaps tend to think that that's enough, as the illusionists say, that we don't have to then, vindicate the reality of the thing, make the judgments come out true. So I certainly encourage you to people to look at that paper. Well, that's a start anyway.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of this video. And so, Dr. Frankish, it was a real pleasure to have you on the show. And I don't know, maybe in the future, when your new book is out, we could have another conversation. So.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed it too, and I'd love to do that, yes. Thank you for inviting me.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel in February 2018, and so I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields, and I would really like to ask you just to consider visiting my Patreon page and making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. And so otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Per Elga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, and Brian Rivera. Thank you for all.